Hey class, welcome to week 7. This week we're about halfway through the semester, and this week we're gonna get into the first national party system. Right, we already talked about some political issues, but this time you get the first organized set of political parties that divide down some pretty substantial issues about what is the United States of America, what's the purpose of its government, and more importantly, what was the revolution about anyway, right? Was it just about independence? Was it about transforming the social relations between people? What is the relationship between the common man versus their social betters, whether because of money or better families or better connections or what? Right? What is America about, right? And so that's what these political issues ultimately boil down to. And in this class, we're going to see and kind of understand how these systems develop, both for the Hamilton side and the Jefferson side. And this is a way of simplifying it, but for the purposes of our class, you can think of it as one or the other, right? Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, some of you might know because of the musical. I know at least one person in the class shared that they really liked the musical, and I'm good. That's fine. I'm not a fan of Hamilton, as you'll see, but um, people know who that is. He's on the $10 bill. He creates one of the major visions of what American society should be, and he's met with opposition by Thomas Jefferson, someone else you probably know, who's been most notorious lately because of a relationship he had with a slave, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. But Thomas Jefferson, he's on the nickel $2 bill. He's he's the Jefferson Memorial in Washington D.C. if you've ever been there. So Jefferson and Hamilton really defined the issues going into the new United States as a country, and they will continue to influence future debates throughout the 19th century and for the duration of our class. So we'll get into that. So within the new United States, 1788 passes, the Constitution's ratified, and the first government's elected. Now, some people thought, okay, maybe John Adams, right? We'll get a little bit more into him, but he was a very famous and important figure in the Continental Congress. Maybe he should be president. But without a doubt, unanimously, most Americans decided that the only person who can ascend the office of the presidency, the only person really fit to sort of be above all of the conflicting issues among the different states, was none other than General George Washington. All right. And George Washington is really important for American politics, not just because of his own personal political interests, and we'll get into some of that, but also just because how he acts as the first president of the United States really sets the tone for future presidents. So, for example, right, there's nothing in the Constitution about the president swearing his oath of office on a Bible. Now, George Washington himself was not particularly religious. He was not a Christian, probably by any stretch of the imagination. He was a deist and a Freemason, and we talked a little bit about that when we discussed the Enlightenment. But nevertheless, it was very important for deists and for George Washington to show that the United States is under divine guidance for government. And the Bible was a symbol of that, right? That the United States would act accordingly to nature's law, to nature's God, and to reason. Right? Not irrational, not driven by people's emotions, but a rational, natural form of government. Right? That was part of what went into some of the justifications for the American Revolution in the first place. Right? Getting away from monarchy, getting away from tradition, etc., etc. Another thing was that George Washington decided only ever to serve 2 terms. Now, it's not until FDR, way in the 20th century, where term limits are legally imposed, because FDR is the first president that gets elected more than 2 times. He actually wins office 4 times, and he dies in his 4th administration as president. Um, but until then, right, people who ran and won the office of the presidency did not go for more than 2 terms because they were following Washington's example. Right? Washington dips out after his 2nd term in 1796. And that sets the template. So almost everything Washington does, everybody's watching, everybody's recording, because this becomes the customs for how a United States president is supposed to act. And so there's nothing in the Constitution about how the executive is supposed to run his office, right? The Constitution gives provisions for the president, right, and the vice president, who actually is not even a part of the executive branch. The vice president is part of the Senate, technically. He's sort of like the president's man, kind of watching over the Senate. But the vice president basically has zero power unless there's a need for a tie-break vote. But the Constitution does create provisions for the president to create departments, offices, appointments that are to help him carry out his goals. So many of the original appointments, right, they're still with us today, right? Your president needs help carrying out his responsibilities for foreign affairs. So he appoints a Secretary of State. President needs help in a time of war. So he appoints a Secretary of War, which will later be renamed Secretary of Defense. President needs help dealing with Indians, so there's a Secretary of Indian Affairs. The president needs help with managing the federal government's use of the money supply, so he appoints a Secretary of the Treasury. So Washington sets the precedent. All other presidents after him appoint the same set of secretaryships, and of course, right, over the years, more and more will get added. But these are sort of the main players. On the one hand, right, John Adams was put forward as a presidential contender. He loses, but when, at least at this point, right, in second place, you become the vice president. Washington's right-hand man in the army and became a really good close friend and basically the brains behind the operations, Alexander Hamilton, he gets appointed to the Treasury. And then Thomas Jefferson, as a fellow Virginian and a very influential revolutionary, he gets appointed as Secretary of State. Now, I've only listed these three offices because these are the most important men who are kind of mixed up in this. John Adams, right, he becomes a very important player kind of later down the line, but is kind of forgotten. Though if you are interested more about John Adams and you're not really in a scholarly mood, HBO made a TV show based on a biography of his life. And while it's not perfect and doesn't get all the details right, it kind of gives you the right mood about how things were going in these days. Hamilton, right, is super important. We're going to talk about his thought, his system. But Hamilton not only has incredible influence over George Washington's policies, but Hamilton gets Washington to appoint many of his friends. I mean, they're all kind of friends. They all knew each other from the Continental Army. But Hamilton gets most of his friends appointed in various other executive offices. And then Thomas Jefferson, who's kind of a lone wolf within the executive branch, he responds to Hamilton's challenge and kind of constitutes the first real political party in the United States. Now, like I said, right, as I'm kind of telegraphing, Hamilton's going to have an incredible amount of influence in dictating policy for the United States. Hamilton's political platform will become the basis of a political party that will sort of form up as a response to Jefferson's efforts, called the Federalists. Right, you're going to want to write this word down, and you're going to want to make sure you know that this is a word that means something different from Federalists last week, right? So last week, Federalists were talking about people who defended the Constitution. This included Alexander Hamilton, who will become a Federalist, and then also James Madison, who helps write the Constitution, who will go on to become a Jefferson man. Jefferson's also in favor of the Constitution, though a little bit wary about it, but he will not be a Federalist. So you want to make sure Federalist is referring to a political party now, not whether you like the Constitution. But even though Hamilton will ultimately influence and kind of create a political platform for the Washington administration, Washington himself, and this was an idea that was common among Republican theorists of government, Washington himself tried to hold his head above all political battles. Right? Washington was not a politician, right? He was, but the goal was to make yourself appear as if you weren't. But Washington tried to appear that he was beyond politics, right? He was elected not because you liked his political party. You didn't elect George Washington because you liked his political platform. You elected him for the man. George Washington was brave. He was incorruptible. He was intelligent. He was diplomatic. He was peaceful and measured. He had good self-control. right? That's what you're looking for, right? Someone who can manage the government, not somebody who's distinctly political. Um, George Washington sort of reflected, at least for some people who are more favorable to monarchy, we'll get back to that. George Washington reflected a kind of Republican king. He was the one who delegated authority, but he himself was not involved in the cut and thrust of politics, right? He wasn't going after people, he wasn't corralling votes, at least not openly. That was the idea. You're not supposed to openly do this stuff. George Washington didn't even run for president in the way that you might expect, right? People had to run for him. People had to put his name forward. It was considered undignified, kind of vain and corrupt if you had to promote yourself for president. You were supposed to let other people do that because it's they who decide you should run, not the other way around, right? You're not the one who goes around, hey, you guys should support me. They're supposed to go around and say, oh, we need to support him. Again, this is part of this Republican image. John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, they all believe in this. Um, but it's a lot of it's formality, right? Thomas Jefferson said, I'm never getting involved in politics, and yet he was super political. The same thing with Hamilton. You just didn't want to give the appearance that you were self-motivated. And so Washington tried to appear as he tried to appear as having no political interests, no political party, and only choosing the best people for the job. However, within the administration, this becomes clearly not the case. Jefferson finds himself deeply at odds with Hamilton and basically the rest of the administration, and will eventually resign his secretaryship and kind of go on the attack from the underground. But let's hash out what are the differences between Jefferson. Now, this is going to be a very complicated part of the lecture, looking at Hamilton and Jefferson as purveyors of systems, which mean Hamilton had his own personal views, Jefferson had his own personal views. They have their own personal biographies, which sometimes influence those views. But these systems are articulated by people far beyond their originators, right? Hamilton's not the only Hamiltonian. Jefferson's not the only Jeffersonian, right? These are systems of thought and visions, right? They're kind of constellations of ideas. There's a bunch of different components. Not everybody agrees on all of them, but Hamilton and Jefferson will have radically different views of how the government is supposed to be. So first, a little bit about Hamilton, right? And of course, if you've seen the musical, you probably know a little bit about this. Hamilton was born in the Caribbean to a mother who got pregnant out of wedlock, and he did not know really his own father, right? So he's what's called a bastard. Um, Now, this was bad for social prestige, right? If, you don't have a father, you don't have legal privileges as his son, and so you're kind of helpless. But Hamilton was very ambitious. He was very ruthless to some extent. And so Hamilton eventually leaves his life behind in the Caribbean. He moves to New York. He finds himself eventually in the heart of revolutionary fervor. Hamilton decidedly joins the Patriot cause. He joins the Continental Army. In the army, he will rise to the rank of general. He will end up being an aide to George Washington after being a military or as an artillery commander for a while. But he basically functions as Washington's right-hand man within the Continental Congress. And so after the war, after the rise and fall of the Confederation, within Washington's new government, Hamilton is key. And remember, of course, right after the war, he will participate in the Constitutional Convention, but his influence comes from the fact that within the world of New York politics, within the world of New York elites, which, if you remember, New York elites tended to be involved in either merchant businesses, right, selling and trading goods from across one state to another or from one country to another, but then also in stock jobbing, the buying and selling of assets, right, ownership of companies, whether land companies or other kinds of companies, and they're deeply invested in the production of goods, though not directly, right? And of course, we'll get to this later, but John Adams is deeply distrustful of Hamilton, mainly because of his connections to the world of New York finance, right? John Adams thinks finance is a con game. It's parasitic, right? It feeds off of the real economy of people farming for a living, who make stuff for a living, and financiers are just gambling with their own money to make more money on top of it. And this was considered immoral by not a few people in the United States. Of course, though, right, Hamilton is involved in this. Now, what did Hamilton want in terms of government? He wanted to model the American system on the British. Now, of course, how does that make any sense, right? Didn't he just participate in a war to overthrow British tyranny in the United States? Well, sort of, right? Now, there were many Americans who were opposed to being ruled over by the British. They didn't want the colonies to be colonies anymore. They didn't want to be a part of the British Empire, but their own unit. They wanted to be America, or at least the different states within America. But Hamilton really admired the British system, right? He just wanted that for the United States. So if you were going to be really uncharitable and kind of cynical, you could say that people like Hamilton and some of the more conservative advocates of the American Revolution, they just wanted a better deal, right? They didn't want to break ties with Great Britain. They didn't want to distance themselves from British ways of life. They just wanted a better negotiating status within with the British Empire. Rather than being under the British Empire as a part of it, they, as a separate and independent power, could negotiate better trade deals with the British and then potentially any other empire, kingdom, republic, or whatever that comes their way. So a lot of this feeds into how Hamilton views things. On the one hand, he's very suspicious of popular rule. And we kind of mentioned this in the previous lecture, right? Hamilton was terrified at the potential of another Shays Rebellion, which actually he'll accidentally help create because of some of his policies. But he's just generally afraid of common people, which you might think is strange because he's this guy, he's a bastard, he's at the lowest rung of society, and he clawed his way to the top. But, society should belong to the victors, to people like Hamilton. Right, Hamilton will marry into New York elite society. His wife, and he also had a string of affairs, but he was married, and his wife was belonged to a wealthy family of landowners. They owned some slaves in the Caribbean on some plantations. So Hamilton was plugged into all of this stuff. Now, he wasn't himself terribly in favor of slavery, but he didn't really care that much. A lot of it, I think, frankly, came down to money. But he didn't trust common people. He didn't trust the poor to sort of govern themselves. And instead, he kind of believed in a sort of like a trickle-down system that the benefit of the country will be maximized if you privilege the elite who run the country. And while this system might breed corruption, and we'll get to points about that, corruption is inevitable. People are not angels. People are going to act selfishly and for their own self-interest. And so the best thing to do is try to create a system where the corruption greases the wheels and allows society to function rather than causing it to collapse. So, I mean, there's a kind of political argument in there, right? Society's corrupt, people are corrupt, or at least corruptible. So the goal is not to make a good society, but at least a functional one, right? It's not about electing moral people. It's about electing people who are competent and get the job done. Now, of course, Hamilton, as a Republican, in the sense of Republican ideas, he wants to elect moral people for government, but he's not going to bank on it. He's not going to place all of his bets on people in government acting selflessly and for the good of all. Another key part, right? Hamilton's plugged into the New York Merchant Society, so he wants to emphasize the importance of trade, particularly with England, which was the North American colony's greatest trading partner. Now, of course, merchants would like to be able to trade with other kingdoms, but Britain had the majority of the trade. So therefore, any kind of foreign alliance, any kind of relationship with another country should privilege the British most of all because they're the number one trade partner. British manufacturing was much superior to American manufacturing, and so Americans relied on buying British goods. So part of this meant that the United States needed to be formed in a way that would privilege trade. Part of this meant designing a government that would maximize all the different sectors of governance within a country, right? So we talked about Polybius last time, that the idea of mixed government. Hamilton believed in it, and he believed that the British were the best at it. So, of course, the president represents the kind of monarchy. The House of Representatives is supposed to represent the democratic impulse and the least trustworthy one. And then the Senate was supposed to represent the aristocratic. And Hamilton really believed this. I mean, he thought the Senate basically should be a House of Lords. He believed, right, that the Senate should be lifetime appointments. He gets defeated when the Constitution is being hammered out, and so senators are only appointed for 6 years, right, within the state governments. But it shows you where Hamilton's heart really lied. He wanted to make the United States government like the British government. He wanted the Senate to be the Lords. He wanted the representatives to be the Commons, and he wanted the president to be something like the king. Now, this all influences the shape of the government, but then what is the point of the government, right? Now, for Hamilton, like I said, the American Revolution was more about independence from Great Britain than some kind of social revolution or changing the very fabric of American society, right? Hamilton wanted to expand trade because he wanted America to become the premier merchant empire and basically replace Great Britain. Modeled on Great Britain, but to replace Great Britain. But of course, dependent upon Great Britain, at least for the time being. So how was Hamilton going to pursue this agenda? Now, you don't need to know this term. Usually I kind of go into it a little bit more in depth in class, but it's a concept that I'm coining and kind of working on, which is the idea of a neo-Robinocracy. Now, none of that probably makes any sense to you. You're not going to find it in your textbook because I made it up. But it's a neo-Robinocracy because the original Robinocracy refers to a time in British government, which was basically the creation of the prime ministership. So if you know anything about Britain or about parliamentary government, you know that there are prime ministers. Now, this didn't happen by choice. Prime ministership appeared within British politics because of the influence of a guy named Robert Walpole, and Robinocracy refers to his government. Walpole was incredibly corrupt, but really good at maintaining power within government. He could control Parliament, and so basically he pushed himself and got the king to appoint him, who was George I at the time, as the head of the Treasury, and in Britain they call it the Exchequer. And that office, which is 10 Downing Street, which is still today the office of the Prime Minister, that put him in control of the money supply. Parliament's main power was power of the purse, and so Walpole used control over the Treasury to basically create a patronage system. Walpole would give out loans to different people, and as a kind of payback, they would be loyal supporters of Walpole and his political party in Parliament, the Whigs, and particularly Walpole's faction of Whigs, which was a little bit more moderate than some of the others. I think Hamilton was trying to do something very similar. I think he saw himself as Secretary of the Treasury stepping into Walpole's shoes. Washington was the monarch. He was the one above politics. Hamilton was going to get in the dirt and get his agenda passed, and he was pursuing basically a Whiggish Walpole version of governance, right? And he was trying to create America in the image of the British mercantile empire, right? His goal was to turn the United States into the premier world power that Britain was, right? This involved a couple of things. One, it meant the federal government was the dominant central power, right? So Hamilton tended to emphasize the importance of the federal government over the constituent states. So this means the federal government's the boss and the states need to follow her lead. Second of all, the federal government as the central power needs a national economic policy, right? We saw that was part of the problem the Confederation got into. They didn't have united economic policy. So the Treasury Department under Hamilton was to guide that policy. And what would that look like? Well, first, he helped pass a bill that consolidated all the individual debts of the states into one national debt, right? Some states were happy about this. Massachusetts still owed a lot of money. Some states like Virginia, which had paid off all of its debts, were very unhappy because now they have to pay taxes on debts that didn't belong to them and that they didn't incur. Now, how was this debt to be serviced, right? How is the United States government going to continue to get money to pay for this, right? First of all, Hamilton will lead the charge to pass a bunch of new federal taxes that will tax people so that the federal government can service the debts that it owes to foreign countries. And in Hamilton's view, the more debts you take out, the more likely other countries will loan you money, and perhaps the more peaceable you will be in the world economy. And the reason being is that, look, if I give you a loan and say I give you a loan of $100 and there's 10% debt on top of it, right? 10% interest rate, you owe me another $10 for every month that you don't pay off that 100. Well, you could just keep paying off the $10. Me as somebody who's giving you a loan might not look too bad upon that, right? Why? Because I'm going to keep getting free money for nothing. So then I'll keep loaning money, the interest rate keeps compounding, and I will continue to rack in more money. So the greater the debt, the greater the credit. The more debt you contract, the more money you can get. Right? This is how credit cards work, right? If you pay off at least the minimum balance every month, the credit card company might reward you with a larger credit line. It's a lot more complicated at a government national level, but that's how it was operating. As long as you can service at least some percentage, 2%, 3%, whatever, on top of the amount that you're loaning, countries will continue to loan to you. But more importantly, you need a way of sort of centralizing the finance, at least within your own country, to continue to contract loans, right? You don't want to just rely on foreign powers, but you want to draw upon your own reserve of merchants and bankers and investors. And the way to do that is to create a kind of federally privileged bank. And this is the Bank of the United States. Now, there'll be a second Bank of the United States, which we'll get into much more with Jackson, and that's super important. And that will fall apart, and something that will replace it, that's somewhat alike, is the Federal Reserve, which is still with us today. If you pull out your money, like if you look at a dollar bill, it's currency released from the Federal Reserve, right? The mint is not the one printing the dollar bills, it's the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, even though it has government oversight, it's a public banking, or it's a private banking outfit, right? It's still a private institution. The first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States were far more private than the Federal Reserve today, right? There was almost no government oversight over what the bank would do. It had stock options. So you or I could go buy stock in the Bank of the United States, and if the bank did well, you did well. So wealthy investors, stock jobbers, right, especially in a state like New York, and right, remember Wall Street, which is the heart of the financial center in the United States, right? And the New York branch of the Federal Reserve is the most powerful of the Federal Reserve banks. New York is the hub for finance, right? Philadelphia comes as a close second. There are merchants in Boston and in South Carolina, Charleston, that are influential and powerful, but banking is being located in New York. And of course, that's Hamilton's home turf. So a lot of these guys are the ones who invest the money and are stock buyers in the Bank of the United States. And the Bank of the United States is to continue to loan money to the United States government. The United States government collects taxes to service the debt from the loans it's contracting with the Bank of the United States. And this seems to be one hand helping the other. So that's Hamilton's view of government. It's very finance and merchant driven. It's basically trying to replicate the British government. And Hamilton is doing this not just to make the United States a slave of Great Britain, right, as some of people accused him, but he wants the United States to become like Great Britain because he believes Great Britain is the only model for a successful empire. And Hamilton did believe the United States would become an empire inevitably, and that's the only way to survive in the world, right or wrong, right? Again, it's like Hamilton with corruption. Corruption's going to happen, right or wrong, you just got to manage it. So that's Hamilton's view of things. Now, like I said, Hamilton's view was very attractive to people like Washington. Washington was not nearly plugged into the world of stock options and investment and banking that Hamilton was. But Washington, as I've mentioned before, was deeply enmeshed in land speculation. Land speculating companies sometimes doubled as banks, giving out loans to people so that they could buy the land that they're trying to sell. And so Washington was quite familiar with this, right? Washington was also afraid of too much popular government. Washington, right, wasn't so favorable to the British as Hamilton was, but he really did desire neutrality, which meant peace with Britain, continuing trade with Britain, also with all other nations, but right, he's not going to antagonize the British. And I have this little note, right, about the Potomac. Washington, D.C. eventually is built as the capital of the United States, and part of the reason for that is because George Washington's buddies owned a lot of land. And the whole idea was to transform the Potomac River into not only the capital city, but also this great trade depot to try to turn Washington, D.C. into the new New York City, to make Washington, D.C. a kind of London. Of course, it's a total disaster. It doesn't work. Washington, D.C. is actually a pretty nasty place to live, especially before air conditioning. It's built on a swamp. You get, mosquitoes and yellow fever, get sick. And it's kind of hard to just sort of build a new city from the ground up when there's all sorts of other powerful cities that already exist. But nevertheless, sort of that shows you kind of where Washington's at. Now, Jefferson is radically opposed to a lot of this stuff, right? He's where Hamilton sees kind of optimistically, oh, well, we'll have some corruption, but we can manage all the corruption. Yes, we're not doing things for the benefit of the common man, but some of this wealth will trickle down. If the elites do well, this will spill down to everyone else within the country, right? The merchants are able to bring more goods in. The merchants make a killing, but average Americans get to buy and sell these goods, right? Jefferson sees it totally opposite, right? In his own kind of recollections of these times, Jefferson will note that trade is deeply destructive to American society. He thinks the American Republic should be made up of a bunch of small farmers. He will consider the small farmer the guy who just owns a small plot of land that he can work with his family. He produces the food he needs. He produces things like hemp and flax and cotton to sort of clothe himself. He doesn't need to buy fancy garments. He doesn't really need to go shopping. He can just provide for himself. And that this small farmer, this was the basic building block for any free country. Right? Jefferson will later change his mind about manufacturing, but he even thinks people who manufacture goods for a living he compares them to kind of like, if you imagine the country as a body, farmers are the healthy parts of the body, and for every manufacturing, it's like having a mole or something cancerous or some kind of open sore. If you look at your, whatever, if a body can sort of tolerate a certain amount of open sores on it. You can be kind of sick, but still get along. But of course, if 50% of the body's open sores, if your body's consumed with cancer, then it will kill you and you'll die. So he thinks the government will collapse under its own corruption in a Hamiltonian scheme, and that it will ultimately make the country unfree. Part of this idea is that the small farmer, it's not just because Jefferson's a romantic about agriculture, though of course he is. He believes the small farmer, by being able to provide for himself, this will teach him how to be a free political subject. So for Jefferson, right, even though he's associated with small government, and he is for small government, but for a very specific reason, Jefferson's not as about small government as much as he is about a independent form of government. And the only way to be truly independent is if your citizens are independent, and the only way your citizens can be independent is if they're economically independent. So the farmer provides for himself, he doesn't depend on other people, so then he won't be a slave to other people, right? The idea was that if you have a society where there are people who are employers and they hire people for wages, like it was the case in Britain and in parts of Europe, or in the case where you literally just have servants, these people will serve their master, right? If you're an employee, right, you depend upon your employer's check to survive, right? You don't provide for yourself, you work for somebody else. And in these days of American politics, if you work for someone else, right, what if you say something that your employer doesn't like? He could fire you. If you do something that it works against his wishes, he'd get rid of you. So you're going to live in a state of fear, right? And it's kind of rational. You want to keep your job, you want to keep your paycheck, you're kind of total line. For Jefferson, right, this was a great blow against any kind of democracy, right? Because if you're just working for your master and say you express your political opinions, and in this day there's no secret ballot, so everybody knows who you vote for when you go to vote. If you vote for the wrong person or express the wrong political opinions, your employer could fire you. And so therefore you end up becoming an extension out of rational self-interest. You become an extension of your employer. And so the wealthy get to control more votes, and the more votes they control, the more power they have over the system, and fewer people can claim control over the government at the expense of the many who are kind of struggling and surviving under their will. And so Jefferson was critical of cities for this reason. He was critical of merchants for this reason, because they're participating in kind of corrupting society. He was somewhat critical of manufacturers, but like I said, he'll change his mind. And he's very critical and very suspicious of banks, stock jobbers, and people who have too much power. Now, it's kind of funny because unlike Hamilton, Jefferson does not come from a lowly background. He's not like John Adams either, who also came from a lowly background, but less scandalous than Hamilton's. Jefferson was a Virginian elite. He was part of the Tidewater dynasty, right? These kind of small planting families that first arrived in Virginia. They bought up all the good land, and they became like basically a landed aristocracy in the state of Virginia. They were all the people elected to government. They were the most influential people. Their words carried a lot more weight than the average Joe who's just trying to participate in politics. So Thomas Jefferson is well-heeled, he's wealthy, he's rich, and he uses that to kind of pursue a very broad and intensive education, right? He reads philosophy, he reads politics, he reads history, he's engaged in art, he's what's called a polymath, right? He's really good at a lot of different things. So he's involved in politics. He helps create the University of Virginia and is the university's first president. He's an inventor. He's interested in all sorts of technology. If you're sitting in a computer chair, that's a swivel chair. Jefferson invented the prototype for that, so you can thank him for your swivel chair. So he did all sorts of crazy things. Now, kind of an infamous part of Jefferson that's come to light in recent years was when Jefferson's running for president. Some of his opponents accuse him of having a concubine, which is basically a non-married person that you're sleeping with, right? That you keep in your house. And they said it was a slave. Now, for centuries, for over a century later, people denied that Jefferson had this relationship, but it's undeniable now. They did DNA tests. It's pretty clear that Jefferson had a sexual relationship with a slave whose name was Sally Hemings, and he had children with her. Now, this relationship may have begun while Jefferson was married. His wife died. He never remarries, and maybe it's because of his relationship with Sally Hemings. But Jefferson remains a bachelor for the rest of his life, and his wife died during the course of the American Revolution. So he's a bachelor for quite a while. Now, some people are on the fence about what this means, right? People who are more rosy and optimistic say, oh, well, look, Sally and Jefferson probably loved each other. There's some kind of mutual relationship or something. Far more critical people will say, rightly, can you really have a mutual relationship with somebody you own? Think of the power dynamics for a slave, right? It's not like she could say no. He literally owns her, and he owns her children. So their future together is very complicated. But nevertheless, right, Jefferson comes from this elite background, but he's very concerned for the common man, the small owner, and that this is the cornerstone to democracy, right? Economic freedom, being able to provide for yourself, starts first, and then you can have political freedom, right? There's no point to having the right to vote if you can't really vote because you're in fear of your employer, right? So Jefferson wants to curb the influence of very powerful, specifically very wealthy people within the United States. So that's why Jefferson will come out very strong against the bank. He will be a very strong states' rights person, but also just because local government has greater control by the common man, and he will be very distrustful of international trade. And so to respond to Hamilton, to kind of resist his efforts, Jefferson starts to coordinate what will become the first political party. So the way to conceptualize this, because it's not like a political party that we have today, the way to conceptualize this is like a wheel. On the one hand, Jefferson is at the center with his man James Madison, and they're at the center of the fight against Hamilton in Congress, right? James Madison's a representative for the state of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson is in the State Department. Eventually he'll leave. But right, they're at the very core of things. And they're the sort of central figures to which people get united. And so out of this, right, totally at the grassroots level, among regular people in the backcountry and in cities like Philadelphia, you get these little societies popping up. You get these, they're called either Democratic societies or Republican societies, which is sometimes they'll just be known as the Republicans, right? Because they're defending America's Republican form of government. Um, but you can consider, it's also democracy is also the name of their party, and they get known as the Democratic Republicans. But all of these wheels, or all these spokes on the wheel form, they're all independent, but they're connected to Jefferson. Jefferson or Madison write to these people. They help coordinate them, right? So a Democratic Republican club in Philadelphia is connected to a Democratic Republican club in Reading, and a Democratic Republican clubs in Pennsylvania are connected to Democratic Republican clubs in North Carolina and New York and Massachusetts. And so they end up forming a kind of wheel, right? Again, this is all grassroots, right? These are political clubs. They're not belonging to the government. Jefferson doesn't create them, but he helps coordinate them. And they all take their kind of energy from Jefferson. Now, this doesn't mean they all are obsessed with Jefferson, but they're all considered Jefferson to be a figurehead, a key ally, right? Somebody who's in the government, who's connected, and who's been a long-term defender of American freedom and for the more radical interpretation of the American Revolution. And they all bind together and try to act as a single group. Now, again, this is not how party politics works today. We're going to talk about how that system starts to develop in a much later time. But, right, suffice to say, this is the first political party. You can call them Republicans, but I would prefer you probably should write Democratic Republicans so you don't get them confused with the later party called the Republican Party, which is still the party today that exists, and that doesn't come around until roughly the Civil War. But these groups hang together and they try to influence public opinion and try to bring more people into these clubs through print. They use printing presses to sort of spread their opinions, to promote Jeffersonian values and ideas, and criticize Hamilton's influence within the Washington government. Now, I'm going to take a little break from all this because while Hamilton and Jefferson offer radically different views about the shape of American government, a kind of crisis of conflict doesn't erupt until the French Revolution, which is really a really important backdrop to American politics within the first decade of its existence as a United States under the Constitution. It doesn't really come to a head until the French Revolution makes it a crisis, right? And so this is just a sort of average point. I'm going to give you a brief, very brief, very, very brief. It's a very complicated set of events. I could go on and on and on for hours. You could teach multiple different classes on the French Revolution. You could have a whole semester devoted just to the French Revolution. But the French Revolution is still really important for understanding American politics, even though it doesn't take place in the United States. And so I would argue, correctly, I believe, that you can't really understand the United States without understanding what's going on in the world, right? Other people, other places influence how things happen in the U.S. And at this point, right, U.S. is a wimpy shrimp nation, not nearly powerful compared to its other European rivals. And most Americans are kind of aware of this at this point, right? They know that they're weak and they know that they're trying to navigate all these challenges, but they also know that they're really far away and so they can kind of do their own thing. So I would say, right, you need to know the French Revolution if you're going to understand U.S. politics, and a lot of U.S. history classes kind of gloss over this stuff. There'll be a paragraph here, a paragraph there, but I want to devote a little bit more time because it's not only because it's super interesting, but I think you need to know about the dynamics there to understand the dynamics that take place in the U.S. and why people are as excited or as fearful as they turn out to be. Okay, so what is the French Revolution? It all starts with the end of the American Revolution. France had finally got its revenge, right? It had lost in the 7 Years' War. It had been smarting under British victory. And now in the American independence movement, right, they got their revenge. They defeated the British. The Treaty of Paris kind of stabbed Britain in the kidney. It kind of dragged them down a level, right? Okay, we got our revenge. But part of the problem was that the vision of how things were supposed to turn out after an independent America went really, really south. First of all, as I mentioned with the Treaty of Paris, the United States kind of cut its own deal with Great Britain. It really, once it could get independence recognition from the UK, it could get a guarantee that they would remove their soldiers from their forts, even though they don't, and that will be important later. And reestablishing trade relationships with Great Britain, France kind of got the short end of the stick. France hoped that this war would result in bigger trade relations between France and the United States, and that this would help pay off the war. And so one of the key lessons to learn in this class, one of the key lessons to learn about history in general, right? It's a rule. It basically applies to anything, is this: wars are expensive. Wars are expensive, right? So the American Revolution was really expensive to fight. France wins, but at what cost? I kind of foreshadowed about the ominous effects of this. So the French government's bankrupt. It owes a lot of money to a lot of people. Trade with America hasn't panned out, so the French government needs to figure out how to get more money. The king at the time, who was rather popular, Louis XVI, and he had a very popular wife. Of course, right, the people will turn against them. Louis XVI, at first, he's this young, dashing, intelligent, somewhat enlightened king. Marie Antoinette, beautiful, elegant, virtuous wife, both very young. Of course, by the end of the French Revolution, by the revolutionaries, Louis will be painted as a tyrant and a despot, and Marie Antoinette will be painted as a whore, as this kind of out of touch, disgusting, vain, kind of prima donna, right? All these nasty epithets hurled at them. But at this point, they're still loved. Now, Louis XVI calls this guy Colbert. You don't need to know much about him, but he's like a financial guy. He's his financial assistant. He asks Colbert to figure out how he's going to start paying off these debts. And remember, France does not have a bank like the Bank of England. It does not have a national bank, whether a private one or a public one. And there's reasons, but we won't get into all that. Colbert's solution is, look, we have to call the Estates General. Now, Louis doesn't want to do this. He fires Colbert. People get upset. Then he rehires Colbert, and Colbert sticks to his guns. And Louis calls the Estates General. Now, what's the Estates General? Really briefly, it's kind of like Parliament. The Estates General represent the three different sections of society. Now, it hadn't been called for over 100 years, so people didn't really know what to expect, which also increased the revolutionary aspect of what could be done with the three estates. But the estates represented a kind of feudal conception of society. The first estate was the church, the ones who pray. The second estate are the nobility, the ones who fight. And the third estate is everybody else, the commoners. And those are the people who work. So the first estate, represented by the church, tended to be bishops who were very influential in kind of French affairs. The church owned a lot of land, right? This is the Roman Catholic Church. But they owned a lot of land. Now, the nobility also owned a lot of land, and those represented the lords and dukes and marquesses and so on and so forth throughout the country. And so together, maybe the bishops in the church, also with the nobility, make up about 5% of the population, right? So that leaves well over 90% of the people stuck in the third estate. This includes the lowliest peasant to a hobo to, a wealthy lawyer, or a wealthy merchant, or a wealthy landowner, or a manufacturer, right? They're all lumped together, and of course, the wealthy elites within the third estate felt kind of slighted. We're included with all these other poor people, right? How can our opinions, which are well educated and important and influential, how can they be reduced in this way, right? Many of these people have been reading literature coming out of Great Britain. They've been reading French philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau, which were critics of the monarchical regime. And so they really expected something more out of this, right? And of course, in a vote between the three estates, if the church owns land and the aristocracy owns land, those are two votes. The third estate gets one vote, even though it's 95% of the country. And so how do you think they're going to vote, right? We got to raise taxes. Should we raise taxes on the land? Well, the church doesn't want to pay, so no. Do the aristocracy want to pay? No. probably the vast majority of the third estate would raise taxes on the land. They vote yes, but they're outvoted. So how are we going to raise taxes? Well, why don't we just tax all the people in the third estate? So that seems to be where it was going and where people thought it would end up. Now the estates are being called, people are being elected to these delegations, and one of the most important French theorists during this period, a guy named the Abbé Sieyès, he was a priest, but he was also a political theorist. He writes a little pamphlet called "What is the Third Estate?" And so the answer to it, right, the question is posed, what is the third estate? And Sieyès' answer is everything. The third estate represents the nation. The aristocracy doesn't represent the nation. The church doesn't represent the nation. Right? This is just a small clique. The third estate encompasses pretty much everyone. And some aristocrats, some nobles, and of course some people in the church, right? Abbé Sieyès, he's a priest, right? Abbé, he's a father, Father Sieyès. They switch sides. They don't want to meet in the first or second estate. They want to be elected to the third estate. Now, while all of this is going on, there's some popular unrest, there's agitation against tyranny in government, and ultimately there's this really important event. It's like the 4th of July for the French. It's called Bastille Day, where a group in, like a mob, a protest group, form in Paris. They form about this ancient castle that was being used as a prison, and they attack the castle prison, which is called the Bastille. They overwhelmed the prison guards. They released the prisoners. That was kind of a jokey thing because they thought all these political prisoners were being held there. But there was only like 12 or 14 people who were locked up. Some of them there because they were mentally insane. But overtaking the Bastille, they end up executing the head of the prison and kind of put his head on a pike and carried around through the streets. This represented this popular blow against ancient tyrannies. This is freedom, where the people of France are finally taking on their own responsibilities and becoming a free nation, right? Whether that was to look more like Britain or something else, they were pushing and pushing and pushing. At the same time, right, there was some trouble with the different estates. The third estate decides to say, the hell with the rest of them. They get locked out of their assembly room, perhaps by accident, but they go to a tennis court and they pledge an oath that they will not stop until the third estate is recognized as the National Assembly, which is ultimately what they're called. Now, they're successful after the fall of the Bastille. The king is kind of put in a complicated situation. He recognizes the third estate as the National Assembly, so he abolishes the other estates. The estates generals go away, and now it's just the National Assembly. And he accepts the revolution so far, where the French draw up a constitution. The monarch's powers are limited, right? So he can't do whatever he wants. And France sort of sees itself in the throes of liberty, right? But this goes horribly wrong, right? The king at the time, Louis, right? He's favorable to some of these enlightened ideas, but he doesn't like his power being curbed. He gets forcibly moved from his palace at Versailles to a palace in the heart of Paris, which is basically under guard by National Assembly soldiers. So he feels like a prisoner. He's moved to the Tuileries palaces. He can't leave and go wherever he wants. And the assembly itself is kind of divided about the nature of the king. Now, the more conservative parts of the assembly, who sit at the right side, so this is the beginning of when you hear right wing, left wing, or leftists, rightists. This all goes back to the French Assembly, and it had to do with where people sat in a room. So whether or not left wing, right wing actually is useful for anything in describing politics, I'll leave that off, but it all comes from the French Revolution. So the National Assembly sits. The people who sit on the right side of the room, they tend to be more favorable of the king. Some of them are even critics of what's happened already, but they're still sitting in the National Assembly. People towards the center, they like the constitutional monarchy. And then the further left you go, there are critics who say, well, maybe we don't even need a king, right? Why can't, giving him the veto, and he had the power to sort of reject any law that he didn't like. Maybe that's too much power. Can we really trust Louis? Can we really trust the monarch is going to support this revolution? And, the majority of the assembly said, no, constitutional monarchy is good. But Louis shoots himself in the foot. What he ends up doing is, it's actually kind of stupid and funny. Louis disguises himself with his family. They escape from the palace. He leaves a note, basically, to his own guards, to tell them what he's doing. So he thought this note would be kept secret, but of course the National Assembly discovers this note. And in this note, Louis says, I never believed in the revolution. All of it's a bunch of bullshit. I've been lying this whole time, basically. Um, you can't have there's no legal way to restrain my power, so I reject this constitutional limitation on me. And I'm going to flee outside of France, where some of Marie Antoinette's siblings, right? She was an Austrian princess. They're going to help me hire some mercenaries. I'm going to reinvade France with the mercenaries. I'm going to surround Paris, arrest the National Assembly, and kind of bring, the revolution to a close, right? Reestablish order, reestablish the old way, right? Maybe I'll make some modifications, right? Louis XVI isn't a brutal tyrant, though he'll be made out to be one, but he doesn't like being forced to move, to be forced to be limited in his power, forced to sort of serve the National Assembly, which he did not think really represented the people. However, the problem is Louis does not successfully escape. He gets captured at a border town called Varennes. He gets brought back to Paris and only proves the left wing of the assembly correct, right? Look, we knew we could never trust him. We knew a king would always get in the way of the revolution. We knew that the monarchy is just attached to these old ways and we have to do away with it. But what would the future of the king be? So they put the king, well, first of all, the National Assembly votes overwhelmingly. They decide to become a republic, which means no more monarchy. But they don't know what to do with the king. They put the king on trial. They reduce him to a citizen. So he's not King Louis XVI, he's Citizen Louis. And they vote on whether he committed treason or not by fleeing, by misusing his royal powers. Some of it's just the simple crime of being a king. And some of these revolutionaries, right, they look for the day where all kings would be executed and be removed. The trial is very close. Many people in the assembly are very uncomfortable with trying a king. They might have been okay with removing him and establishing a monarchless republic, but they do not want to execute him. Nevertheless, the vote passes. Louis is executed. Marie Antoinette's executed, both for treason. And this starts a really intense part of French history known as the Terror. Now, what is the Terror? Right, it sounds bad, right? And it was bad. Increasingly, a faction within the left wing of the National Assembly, known as the Montagnards, the Mountain, or also known as the Jacobins, they increasingly become the sole power within the assembly. They actually reduce the assembly's power and kind of consolidate power in a subgroup known as the Committee on Public Safety. And the leader of the Jacobins is a man named Maximilien Robespierre. Now, you don't need to know any of this, but it helps you, gives you some context of why people in America were afraid and why people in America were fearful of Jefferson being such a pro-French ally. Now, the Terror ends up becoming a kind of bloodbath, right? Anyone against the government could be summarily executed. Their trials basically operated as show trials. Your crime is possessing the wrong political opinion. So if you said anything against Robespierre, have you said anything against the Jacobins? Have you said anything against the National Assembly? Have you said anything against the revolution? Right? And sometimes it was kind of trivial. And of course, some people supported the revolution and then found themselves on the outs. So a very important figure in American history and French history, the Marquis de Lafayette, which is what Lafayette College is named after. He serves in the American Army as a French attachment to help General Washington. He'll come back to France. He'll support the revolution, but he's more moderate. He wants a constitutional monarchy. He goes against the Jacobins. He ends up getting exiled. And he tends to be, one of the more fortunate ones where lots and lots of people just get executed. And they get executed through the new invention of the guillotine, which is lops off your head. Very quick, very clean, supposed to be painless and humane. I think it's funny that it was invented by a dentist. Nevertheless, the guillotine gets associated with this period because the Jacobins used the Terror to great effect and execute any political enemies, any counter-revolutionaries, or anyone opposed to Jacobin rule in the government. And this goes on for about a year and a half. Now, This sounds really brutal. You got literally blood running down the streets. Some executioners were kind of sick. They would play games. How many people can you kill in a minute? Sometimes the executions, there were too many people to kill, so they found more uh, convenient ways of execution. So they just put people on a raft, maybe load up a raft with like 50, 100 people, put it out in the middle of a lake and just set it on fire and kill all the people by drowning or burning or whatever. Um, but having said all of that, the terror needs to be understood in its context. As I said, Louis had petitioned other royal houses, other kingdoms of Europe to help him reclaim his powers. So when they executed Louis, basically every country in Europe went to war with France. And France's army was very dysfunctional. It didn't have clear or great leaders at this time. And so every battle lost seemed to be nearing the end of the French Revolution. And of course, if you participated in this, to whatever extent, it was a very real possibility that if you lost, if a foreign army occupied Paris, that if Louis' siblings, or his brothers or sons who could take the throne, if they came to Paris and reinstalled the old government, all of these people would get executed for treason. So winning the war was of the utmost priority. And so the terror was about checking political rivals, right? People who were critical of the revolution that could undermine the government's war effort. At the same time, not everyone in France supported the revolution. Many people in the countryside did not like the revolution, especially, we won't get into it, but the revolution radically changed the relationship of the church to French society. Many people in the French countryside saw the revolutionary government as basically trying to destroy the church, so they took up arms against the government in Paris. So now the Jacobins under Robespierre, they're fighting a three-front war, fighting against Spain, fighting against potential British invasion, and fighting against Germans and Austrians who are trying to invade from the east. And then you also have a civil war where people are rising up against the government in different parts of the countryside. So in some ways, you can understand the terror as a sort of extraordinary times requiring extraordinary events, right? You're going to have to do horrible things if you want to prevent an even horrible reality. So that's how they justified it. Right? You don't have to agree with it, but the terror made a level of political sense. Now the Jacobin wiped out their kind of more moderate but more solidly Republican enemies known as the Girondins. Robespierre takes over, but his reign of terror only lasts for about a year. Eventually, the assembly is sort of worn out. The blood being shed kind of puts people to a crisis. Some of Robespierre's allies realize he's not able to pull off the victories. Right, the civil war continues to rage. The French army is not able to hold back and defeat these other European powers, and so the assembly turns against Robespierre. His allies all get executed by the guillotine, and then apocryphally, right, this is a story that may or may not be true. Um, Robespierre, when he's executed, he's turned the other way around so that he can. Right, normally on the guillotine, your head is facing down, so you do not see the blade coming, so you don't know the moment of death. So it's clean, painless, and kind of instantaneous. That's the idea. But for Robespierre, they flipped him upside down. For all the blood that he shed, for all the lives that he was responsible for taking, they wanted him to know just how horrible the guillotine and just how horrible the terror was. So they put him on the guillotine face up, so he could see the blade coming inch by inch down until his neck was sliced off. Right. But that's the end of Robespierre and the end of the terror. And so this moment of reaction is known as the Thermidorian reaction. And from this point on, the French government shifts in a still revolutionary, but much more conservative and actually somewhat more corrupt direction, where it's ruled by a few, an oligarchy, under the form of government known as the Directory. There's still a republic, right? It's not a dictatorship. It's not a return to monarchy, so don't get conservative confused with monarchy. There's still a republic, and they're still at war, right? So just real quick, these pictures right here on the left, that's the Bastille storming, that's celebrating the end of French tyranny. The bottom picture is the tennis court oath, where the Third Estate proclaims itself the National Assembly and will not cease to meet until the king recognizes their authority as the voice of the nation. Here on the left, you can see the guillotine, right? That's the execution of Louis XVI. Here you see how a guillotine operates, right? He's face down, but in the case of Robespierre, right, he would die face up, maybe, if that story's true. And then at the bottom right, this is a British cartoon making fun of the French Revolution. And we're not going to get into the British scene, but there were some people in Great Britain that were excited about the French Revolution. Maybe not the Jacobin parts, but they were excited about revolutionary fervor, about changing British society. And of course, there were critics in Great Britain that saw the revolution as a nightmare. So this cartoon is making fun of all the British who would want the revolution to come to Britain, right? This is what you're asking for. Blood in the streets, anarchy, noble people getting whipped in public by a guy who looks like he's not even wearing pants. And just chaos, craziness, madness, murder. Everything's turned upside down. You got this guy. This guy's decapitated, and so this was a nightmare for people in Britain and for people who were pro-British, like Hamilton. This is what they were afraid of for any support for the French. So as I mentioned, right, Hamilton responding to the Jeffersonians, right, he's going to get into the grit and mud and dirt of politics. So Hamilton tries to organize his own political party known as the Federalist Party. And so you need to just, again, I already mentioned this, make sure you know that this is different from the Federalists who are defending the Constitution, right? James Madison will be a solidly Jeffersonian Republican, but he supported the Constitution. So in an earlier epoch, he was a Federalist. Now he's a Republican. Hamilton was a Federalist in both stages, but the terms mean different things, even though it's the exact same word. All right, so people in the United States are getting agitated. On the one hand, and this is what makes it a real political crisis. On the one hand, Hamiltonians, people who support Hamilton, and generally the policy of the Washington administration, is much more pro-British. And some of the pro-Britishness is derived from not only love of Britain, but fear of France. They see the Jacobins as another manifestation of absolutist tyranny, right? Rather than rule by a monarch, a dictator, a sovereign despot. Now it's being run by Robespierre and by mobs in the streets of Paris. So they see this all as part of the same chaos, and they want nothing of it, right? You need to restrain the people. That's the only way to have an ordered government. Now, Jefferson, on the other hand, is very favorable to the French. Jefferson was close friends with the Marquis de Lafayette. Jefferson was close friends with many people working within the more moderate wing of the French Revolution. He was friends with Tom Paine, right? We read his Common Sense. Thomas Paine will go and actually be elected as a member of the National Assembly. And so more moderate people were actually deep friends with Jefferson. However, even during the most bloody parts of the Terror, Jefferson is sort of skeptical. On the one hand, he doesn't believe that it's as bad as it was. Second of all, he's willing to sort of forgive chaos and anarchy. Now, there's a kind of common quote from Jefferson where he says, "The tree of liberty is watered with the blood of patriots and tyrants. This is its natural manure." Now, what does he mean by that? He means that if liberty is to survive, you're going to have social conflict. You're going to have people who want to be tyrants. They're going to want to take over. They want to be dictators. And then you're going to have people who are fighting for the freedom of the nation. And they're going to fight. There's going to be blood that's shed, but this conflict renews the country's commitment to freedom. So Jefferson's willing to sort of forgive what's happening in France, right? He sees a country that had been ruled by an absolute monarch for over a century. He sees a people who have been wildly oppressed for a very long time. And so he expects, just like if you lock a dog in a small cage for too long and then you let him out, he's going to go nuts for a bit, right? And so he sees, right, this popular demonstration, even the execution of the king and queen and the overthrow of the monarchy, this is just like a birth, right? And like a woman giving birth, it's violent, there's lots of screaming, there's pain, there's blood, there's other stuff, but then, right, there's life. So you got to get through the birth pangs, you got to get through the suffering so that you can get to a new world. And so Jefferson had hope that the French would overcome this, and that any kind of support for the British was basically trying to reject France's republican form of government, and then more importantly, it was rejecting America's form of republican government. Shouldn't France and America, as sister republics, be the most natural of allies rather than siding with the British monarch? So that's the idea. Jefferson sees Hamilton and his friends, their support for Britain, as more proof that they actually don't want anything to do with the American Revolution, and they're basically trying to turn American society strictly into a version of Britain, including its aristocracy, its class system, and a huge population of servants. Now, of course, right, you might be thinking through this whole time, gee, how can Jefferson really be that concerned about servants when he owns slaves? And there's not really a resolution. Jefferson hates slavery, and yet he continues to own slaves. He wants to get rid of slavery. We'll see some of the ways he does act against this in a later lecture. But at the other time, right, he defends the Southern planter way of life. So it's contradictory. It's hypocritical in some ways. But Jefferson doesn't resolve all of these tensions in his own life, and it's up to some of his followers in later eras to kind of try to force the contradictions together and decide one way or the other. Nevertheless, Jefferson loves freedom, even as a slave owner. And so Jefferson really pushes against Hamilton's embrace of Great Britain and its system. And this is manifest in how the government acts. So in 1791 and 94, right, we talked about how Hamilton was pursuing new taxes. And one of the new taxes that Hamilton levied was a tax on liquor, particularly whiskey. There were a lot of people who depended upon making liquor for a livelihood. They thought Hamilton's tax system under the Washington administration was basically stripping them of their freedom, squeezing the last few drops of money out of them, leaving them poor and homeless potentially because they wouldn't be able to afford a home, they wouldn't be able to afford land. And so a number of these people got together and they rebelled. Now, Washington wasn't going to take any of this, right? And so, uniquely, Washington is the first and only president to ever use his power as commander-in-chief. He assembles an army, he marches out to the whiskey rebels, and he says, if you do not go home, I will destroy you. Now, those aren't his exact words, but it was very clear he was not going to negotiate. Not like this. So the whiskey rebels, they were shocked. Washington marched out against them. They love Washington. He's still a hero to most people. And so they went home without any violence, without any bloodshed. But it showed how angry people were with an intensifying central government that seemed less and less interested in the plight of the common man, and that these taxes were crippling people. And then on top of it, Washington does the unthinkable. He signs the Jay Treaty. Right? So you want to make sure, I'm just going to underline, both of these terms are important to know, right, and their significance. Now, the Jay Treaty, the problem with this, right, Washington sends out, one of his loyal allies, John Jay, who's a New Yorker. He goes to Great Britain, and he hashes out a treaty with them. Now, the problem with this treaty is that Washington is willing to basically sacrifice everything for the sake of neutrality. So what this treaty guarantees is that the British will stay out of American waterways, right? They're not going to attack them. The British are also going to maintain good trade relationships with the United States, which is a huge thing to Hamiltonians. And part of the success of the United States depends upon maintaining good trade with Britain. And the other thing, which is kind of silly when you think about it, I think, is that Britain reaffirms its commitment to removing the soldiers from the forts. Now, of course, if you remember, right, they already said they were going to do that, and then they didn't do that in the Treaty of Paris, right? So this seems to be like a dumb sweetener, right? How is this supposed to be a good thing when you're just saying you're going to finally do what you always promised to do anyway? But anyway, that was part of the deal. But the bad part was that this treaty did nothing to deal with the fact that American sailors were being impressed. And let me tell you a little bit about that. During the war, right, Britain joins the war effort against the French Republic, and it needs sailors for its navy. It needs boats, and it needs people to arm those boats and fight on those boats. And for many British naval strategists and for many British naval commanders, the Americans are not really independent. Now, the government signed a treaty, but to hell with that, right? They're still British subjects, and as subjects of Britain, in its time of need, it can require its subjects to serve its country, whether it wants to or not. So imagine this. This is what would happen. You're an American sailor, you're on a boat, maybe it's bound for Europe, it's bound for the Caribbean, who knows, right? You're there to run the ship and engage in some merchant deals, right? Buying and selling some stuff. But while you're on your way, a British ship pulls up right next to you, says, guess what, boys? You now work for the British Navy. You might be out in 4 years, you might be out in 6 years, who knows? You might die, who knows, right? But you got to sacrifice your life and your time and your energy and your wealth for Great Britain now. And this ship also, right, maybe the merchant guys on board, this ship now belongs to Britain. It's now going to be outfitted for war with France. And, I'm sorry, you're the owner, too bad. Now, a lot of Americans, rightly, were upset that the British were basically violating their national sovereignty. The United States was basically being treated like a set of colonies again. And the great blow of the Jay Treaty to Jefferson and many Republicans was that the treaty did nothing to deal with this. So you're basically selling out. You're going to ally with Britain, which the Republicans didn't really want to do anyway. And you're going to ally with Britain at the expense of American sailors. So this was unthinkable. The vote was really close. And ultimately, John Adams casts the deciding vote, and he votes in favor of the Jay Treaty, even though he doesn't like everything in the treaty, even though he'd like to have a better treaty where American sailors weren't being kidnapped and impressed into foreign service. He's willing to pick neutrality over potential war with Great Britain. And remember, America doesn't even have a navy at this point. America barely has an arms, a military that's capable of fighting Great Britain. The only thing keeping the British from the United States is the Atlantic Ocean. And if the British are willing to invade, then that will be really tough. So all of this kind of comes ahead in the Washington administration. Washington becomes very unpopular sometimes. Parts of the country create papier-mâché dolls of John Jay and set them on fire to show their hostility and their protest. These Democratic Republican clubs sort of question the virtue of George Washington. I skipped over it, but if you go on the other slide that we just looked at, that's a political cartoon criticizing Washington, basically selling out the country. Anyway, Washington serves a second term. He's very old. He's tired. He's done. So he decides not to run for a third term. So to retake his place, Vice President John Adams, right, the great hero of the Continental Congress, right, again, we didn't get into his personal biography too much, but Adams runs, and it's very close. Mainly because of the influence of American merchants and the interests of the merchant class who are invested in trade in Britain and committed to maintaining neutrality in trade. Adams barely squeaks out a victory, but because Jefferson comes in second place, Jefferson is his vice president. So that kind of puts Adams in a very awkward position where his enemy, his political rival, has a seat in his government. But Adams is a very unique guy, right? You can't chalk him up to just being another Federalist. He's not exactly like Washington. He's definitely not like Hamilton. Very briefly, John Adams, he grew up in very humble circumstances. He will become a lawyer, then he becomes a great advocate for American independence. He will be the ambassador to Great Britain, the first ambassador for the United States. And because he's overseas, he doesn't participate in the Constitutional Convention. But when he gets back, he becomes vice president. Now, Adams is a very unique guy in the sense that he's very hard-headed. He has a very strong sense of what's right and what's wrong, and he's very independent-minded. He doesn't like Hamilton because he thinks Hamilton's form of money making, or his form of income, his stock jobbing and his connection to banks and merchants, he finds this kind of ugly and detestable, an immoral way of living. But Adams is very committed as a Federalist, nevertheless, right? In contrast with Jefferson, Adams wants stronger central federal government. And he wants to honor George Washington's legacy by preserving the peace, right? Adams is totally on board with the need for the United States to stay out of all foreign wars, right? No war with France, no war with Britain. Do not side with the British, do not side with the French, and if possible, be friends with everyone. Now, again, the political consequences continue to tighten the noose, and Adams gets put in increasingly difficult situations. But he is committed. Probably the one thing about his administration you can bank on is he's committed to neutrality. But the Jeffersonians distrust Adams. Adams wanted to honor Washington. Again, he believes in that Republican ideology where you're supposed to be above politics. You're not supposed to pursue your own interests. So when Adams takes the presidency, he rehires all of the people that were in Washington's administration, which means he rehires all the people who were Hamilton's allies. So at this point, Hamilton sort of stepped out of government. It became too hot for him, but he's basically running things behind the scenes. Now, Adams is put in a really difficult situation because of the Quasi-War. Adams sends diplomats to France to try to hammer out a new deal, right? Some of the French revolutionaries are getting kind of antsy about where America is going to line up. They remember that the Americans basically stabbed them in the back at the Treaty of Paris, right? They did not create the trade relationships that the French government hoped for. They felt like the French were slighted because the Americans would naturally gravitate back to the British. They have much in common. They speak the same language. They have the same customs, the same basic forms of government, and so on and so forth, right? And they have a lot in terms of trade. So the French are not really banking too much on the United States as a worthy ally, and they expect more from them. Now, Adams sends these diplomats saying, let's have a peace treaty, right? We do not want to be at war with you. We do not want to be at war with Britain. We want to be neutral. And we want to trade with you if possible. Now, when Adams gets he sends this guy, John Marshall, who will be the first Supreme Court justice, or he'll become a Supreme Court, or the head of the Supreme Court later on. But Marshall comes back with really bad news. He basically tells Adams that the French government, and this is known as the XYZ affair because Marshall doesn't use the people's names. He just replaces them with the letters X, Y, and Z. And Adams leaks this to the public. And in this letter, the French government basically says, we'll only do business with you if you bribe us. And when we make a deal with you, you have to give us an outrageously large loan, right? With really favorable interest rates. And of course, for Adams and for people in the American government, they don't know how long the revolutionary government's going to last. It could collapse overnight, right? They've already been through several forms of it. They've seen the constitutional monarchy give way to the Jacobins. They've seen the Jacobins collapse and form the Directory. So, they didn't really know what was going to happen next. So Adams is deeply offended, and many of the Federalists in his administration push for greater anti-French policies. And so under Adams, right, he passes, and this is a key term, I'll circle it just so you remember, the Aliens and Seditions Act. Now what does this act do, right? The first part of the act, the aliens part, says there are too many French people basically in the United States, and a bunch of them, we'll get to the reasons why in another lecture, but there were a bunch of French people in Philadelphia, which was the capital at the time. There were a bunch of French people in some of these urban situations. How do we know they're not government agents? And of course, some of them certainly were. They wanted Americans to side decidedly on behalf of the French Revolution and to arm themselves against the British. The French Revolution encouraged merchant ships to arm themselves and attack British merchant ships. So they're stirring up trouble. So the American government, but there's only a few of them. But the American government says, okay, well, these people are a problem. We need to export them. So they would try to round up all the French and send them out of the country, that every Frenchman is a potential spy, and we can't trust them. The other half of the act, the seditions part, has to do with people who are critical of the government. Now remember, Jefferson and the Republican parties throughout the country, the Democratic Republican parties, these clubs, they got printing presses and they're publishing stuff that's critical of the government. They write nasty things about Adams. They write nasty things about Washington. They write nasty things about Hamilton. And of course, right, this isn't just them. Hamilton write really the Federalists pump up their printing presses and they start writing evil things about the Jeffersonians, about how they're, crazy. They want Jacobin terror. They want blood in the streets. All this horrible stuff, right? But under Adams' administration, Congress passes this law that says if anyone's critical of the government, they can be fined, they can have their printing presses shut down, and they can be arrested potentially indefinitely. So that's right. It's this law deports people for being the wrong ethnicity, right? Secret agents, by the fact of them being French or looking kind of French or acting too French, and then censorship. So, as you might think, right, how could this law pass? This is clearly a blow against the First Amendment, but it kind of brings up Madison's point. Are these not anything more than paper barricades? Do these laws do anything, right? If someone doesn't want to act on the law, couldn't they just circumvent it? Couldn't they just get around it, right? And in some ways, that's what this Congress does, right? They pass a law to restrict speech. Now, of course, right, it's not formally against the First Amendment. First Amendment does not protect speech that causes a public danger. And so in the seditions, part of the Alien Sedition Act, writing bad things about the government in a time of war or potential war, right? There isn't any war declared. This is why it's called the quasi-war, because even though there's all this anti-French hostility, the government never declares war on France. But this has a lot of parallels to today, right? The idea that there are some people who talk, right? You got to censor social media, you got to censor what people talk because there are all these Russian agents running around, right? There's a lot of fake news. So we need to crack down and use the government to sort of restrain what people can read and what people can't read. We need to be able to tell them because this is threatening the very institutions that form our government. Now, of course, for the Federalists, this was very self-motivated, right? If people are panicked, if they're afraid, they're paranoid, they think they're all these secret French agents, that all these Democratic Republican clubs are all secretly working for the French, trying to draw the United States into a bloody battle against Great Britain, a war that they cannot win, and a war that's motivated by ideology and by foreign interests and foreign money, right? They're going to kind of vote to keep this government in power and possibly strip away more and more liberties. So Thomas Jefferson refers to the Adams administration in this period of time under the Quasi-War as the reign of witches. And it's this kind of superstitious this superstitious moment where they've put a spell over the people with fear mongering and panic, creating and inducing people to throw away their freedoms for greater security. So there's a little bit more in the textbook. I'm not going to get into it too much, but Jefferson and Madison help construct the Virginia and the Kentucky resolutions. Now, Jefferson has more influence on the Kentucky resolution and Madison in the Virginian resolution, and they both do it kind of anonymously. But both of these statements are about the rights of the states to reject federal laws if the federal laws violate the Constitution. So Kentucky and Virginia were big states in favor of Jefferson. And so many of the people there who are running the government, they're going to refuse, right? We're not going to shut down printing presses. We're not going to allow federal agents to close down the voice of the people, right, to promote fear-mongering. And so these texts have been normally interpreted as states' rights documents, and they are in favor of states' rights. They're about the right of the state of Kentucky and state of Virginia to defy the federal government and the law of Congress. But it's not so much about the states' rights to reject the federal government, but the states' rights to interpret the Constitution and defend themselves from unconstitutional forms of government. So if the federal government's going to break the Constitution, the states are the ones that are going to uphold it, right? So Jefferson, right, and Madison and many of the Republicans, they're struggling. Some of them get locked up. A bunch of French people get exported. And Hamilton seems to be on the verge of a military dictatorship. At least that's how the Republicans paint it. Adams commissioned the creation of a new army to fight the French if they land in the United States, which turns out to be a total fantasy, right? Again, kind of hysteria that there are these French agents and that they're going to land secretly a French force to conquer the United States. Totally ridiculous. But this fear was perceived as a real threat. And so Adams commissions a new army. He puts George Washington, who's in his 80s, right? He's a very old man. He puts him at the head of the army. But as Jefferson feared, right, who is Washington's right-hand man in the military? It was Hamilton. And when Washington dies during this period, Hamilton will assume command of this army, and have a military presence in the country ready to fight any foreign threats. And again, Hamilton thinks and Hamiltonians think that this is protecting the government from foreign influence. But of course, the issue is, does this foreign influence really exist, or is this a way of just curbing unpopular opinions that are threatening a system of government that disadvantages trade with Great Britain and kind of is too favorable to the mob, to the people, to the democratic forms of government that the Democratic Republican clubs seem to exhibit. Now, none of this ends up happening, right? As I mentioned, Adams is very stubborn, and that will be a trait that we'll see in his son, who will be an important political figure we'll talk about. But Adams keeps sending diplomats to France. The Directory government kind of collapses, or it becomes under the influence more and more of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's not dictator, he's not in any real power, but he's running things behind the scenes. Sort of the main force. He gets welcomed in the government, but he's not the only one. But under Napoleon's influence, the French government decides to sign a peace treaty with Adams, that there's no real reason to fight the United States, that the French government needs to focus on its war with Great Britain and with the other powers in Europe. And if they can continue to trade with the United States, if they can get neutrality from them, at least that they're not going to interfere on the side of the British, then that's good enough. So Adams gets this back, but it's too late for the election. Right? Adams refuses to use the army. He abolishes he takes away Hamilton's command. He sends the army away. Right? We don't need an army if there's not going to be an invasion. But this is all kind of late, and Adams doesn't really care because he'd rather do the right thing than to score political points. And of course, this infuriates the Federalists because he seems to be throwing away the election. 1800 rolls around. Jefferson wins hands down. The Republicans win at least hands down. Now there's some controversy because Jefferson actually ties with another Republican named Aaron Burr. We'll learn more about him a little bit in the next class, but he's a super interesting figure, very shady. Now, Hamilton hates Jefferson, but he hates Burr even more because at least Jefferson in Hamilton's eyes has some honor and is respectable, and whereas Burr is totally unscrupulous and is willing to do anything for power and for money. So Hamilton helps, Jefferson wins, and in 1800, Thomas Jefferson becomes the third president of the United States. And so in the next lecture, and we're not going to quite follow the textbook, right? Because if you're following, this is basically the second half of chapter 6, but in a lot more detail, and to kind of get the conceptual underpinnings of why all of this is important. But in the next lecture, we're going to look at the effects of Jefferson. We're going to look at his successors, James Madison and James Monroe, and we're going to see how the United States transforms into a much more self-confident national government. So until then, hang in there, guys. Go with peace. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.